In the aftermath of the Iraq War and the fall of Saddam Hussein, the execution of Saddam's eldest son remained shrouded in controversy and brutal details. Uday Hussein, known for his ruthless behavior and feared for his violent temper, was a figure whose demise was as dramatic as his life. While the world witnessed the downfall of his father, the circumstances and sheer brutality of Uday's execution are stories that often go untold. Uday and his brother Qusay, two of the most notorious figures in Baathist Iraq, were feared greatly and had many enemies. These two lived lives by the sword, murdering and killing with impunity, and eventually died by the sword. Saddam Hussein, the great tyrant of Iraq, was not alone in his cruelty. To positions of power, he appointed his personal friends, many of whom he had grown up with. He also favored family members, safe in the fact that they would not betray him. The two most famous recipients of his nepotistic gratitude were Uday and Qusay Hussein, his two sons. Both sons were very much like their father. They were cruel and sadistic, and did not accept failure from their subordinates. Qusay, born in 1966, was the younger of the two brothers. He had played a pivotal role in crushing the Shiite and Kurdish rebellions following the 1991 Gulf War, which included both the massacre and forceful eviction of thousands of Iraqi Shia Muslims and Kurds. Both the Iran-Iraq War and the Gulf War had ended only recently, and Iraq's defeat in both led opposition groups to believe that time was right for a regime change. Opposition groups quickly gained control of many provincial towns and cities, but religious and political divisions meant the various militias were splintered and often unsupportive of one another. After what seemed like a quick victory, pro-Saddam forces managed to retake land and a brutal and violent suppression of innocent Shiites and Kurds began. The inhabitants of the towns and cities captured by the rebels were all punished equally, whether they were responsible or not. Columns of soldiers marched into the cities, with civilians as human shields, and opened fire at random, killing thousands. Helicopters and tanks were used to destroy buildings, and many were taken prisoner, executed, and buried in mass graves, many of which were discovered following the coalition invasion. Anywhere from 50 to 100,000 were killed, mainly civilians. With the draining of the Mesopotamian marshes and other acts of intentional displacement, 2 million Iraqis were made refugees, with many fleeing to Iran and Turkey. Refugee columns were attacked indiscriminately by the Iraqi Republican Guard, who were commanded by Qusay, and who fired on the refugees from the ground, and with jets and helicopters. Qusay was also responsible for ordering the execution of thousands of prisoners, political and criminal, to free up room in the overcrowded Iraqi prisons. As head of the elite Iraqi Republican Guard, a military force independent of the army, answering directly to Saddam through his son, Qusay possessed immense power. He was also, at one point, the world's most successful bank robber, having stolen $900 million and 100 million euros from the Bank of Baghdad, on his father's orders, immediately before the invasion. Qusay was a tyrant and a murderer, but unlike his brother, he was calculated. His violence was reserved for the enemies of his father, and he was, in his personal life, a reserved and level-headed family man. Uday, born in 1964, was Saddam's first child, and Saddam's heir apparent until an almost fatal assassination attempt in 1996. Unlike his younger brother, he was not politically minded, and so was kept away from the important centers of power by his brother. Despite his lack of real political influence, he still enjoyed almost total immunity. He was allowed to indulge himself in his most sadistic fantasies and was known for prowling the streets of Baghdad with his armed entourage, scouring nightclubs and even weddings for unwilling women. He controlled his paramilitary group, the Fedayeen Saddam, who were responsible for some of the regime's most brutal acts. His taste for sexual violence would almost be his downfall. Every Thursday he arrived in Mansour to search for women, and this routine allowed his enemies the opportunity to get close and kill him. 4 men of the 15 Shaban movement organized a plan to ambush him in Mansour and kill him, never expecting to survive the attack or long after it. After weeks of Uday missing his usual Thursday's depravity, the plan was almost abandoned, until Salman Sharif, the head of the operation, was given one more chance. Waiting outside an ice cream parlor, keeping an eye out for their target, they spotted Uday in his vehicle and were amazed to find he was alone and without security. As the car passed, they opened fire, they emptied their weapons and made a getaway without ever having a shot fired back at them. They spent the next day at a safe house until returning by bus to their base. Many other dissident groups claimed responsibility, and Sharif and the men of 15 Shaban believed they had gotten off scot-free until one of their members was arrested in Jordan and handed over to Iraqi police. Soon the truth was out, and the 4 men were on the run. Sharif's 7 brothers and his father were executed, with the other conspirators facing similar punishment. Uday had received 17 gunshot wounds, but survived, albeit partially disabled. The war begins. As the war began, both Uday and Qusay were on the front lines with their respective forces, fighting against the coalition invasion. The Republican Guard were believed to be an elite force. They received superior training and equipment and had access to tanks and heavy weaponry. Despite some early successes, Qusay was found to be an incapable commander, unwilling to make any serious decisions on his own. In contrast to its fearsome reputation, the Republican Guard collapsed soon after the invasion began. Even before the first shots had been fired, it's believed that 23% deserted their posts, either surrendering or going into hiding. The Fedayeen, on the other hand, was little more than a ragtag militia. They received no serious military training, had access to little more than rifles and RPGs, and were nothing more than a group of bandits, incentivized to loot from their fellow Iraqis, as they received no official salary. Even with all these disadvantages, the Fedayeen proved to be incredibly loyal and a much more effective fighting force, wreaking havoc on American soldiers and supply convoys. Baghdad fell within a month of the invasion, and with it, Saddam's power. Many men of the Fedayeen, Republican Guard, and regular army continued to fight on, joining various pro-Saddam or Islamist insurgent groups. But Uday and Qusay, rather than continuing the struggle, went into hiding. The 2 brothers were complicit and active participants in Saddam's brutal reign, and American forces wished to capture them as much as they did their father. While Saddam was the #1 most wanted, his sons were next on the list, and a $30 million bounty was placed on their heads. On the 21st of July 2003, the American soldiers of the 101st Airborne Base were approached by Nawaf al-Zaidan, a local businessman, claiming to know the location of Qusay and Uday. He gave detailed information and perfect descriptions of the 2 brothers. With such a large reward, the Americans were still skeptical. Zaidan underwent a polygraph lie detector test and passed. The businessman was a close friend of Saddam and his family, even going so far as to claim to the others that he was their cousin. But the seemingly inevitable American victory and life-changing reward were too much to ignore. The decision was made to raid the brothers' location, Zaidan's lavish mansion, and a plan was hastily put together. With less than 24 hours' notice, the task was given to the men of the 101st Airborne Infantry Division and a small cadre of Task Force 121, a special operations group consisting of men from Delta Force, Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, and others. The end of Uday and Qusay. At 10 a.m. on the 22nd of July, the building was surrounded. Loudspeakers broadcast a request for a peaceful surrender, but went unanswered. After some time waiting, the men of Task Force 121 prepared to storm the building. In one last hope for a bloodless victory, they knocked on the door, but were again ignored. The men forced their way through the door and instantly came under fire. The brothers and their supporters, including Qusay's 14-year-old son, had fortified and barricaded themselves in the upper floor. A brief firefight ensued, in which 3 American soldiers were wounded. The retreat was ordered, and as they left the house, fire came from the windows, injuring another soldier. Within minutes, half of the men of Task Force 121, comprised of some of the American military's finest fighting men, had been injured and were out of the fight. Indoors, close-quarters combat is difficult and dangerous, even for highly skilled individuals, and so the decision was made to attack from outside, to level the building until the brothers were fed up of fighting or dead. The soldiers surrounding the building opened fire with everything they had: rifles, automatic grenade launchers, anti-tank missiles, and heavy machine guns. Almost 2 hours into the battle, with the building half ruined, the defenders continued fighting. Automatic rifle fire came from every window and hole in the wall, while grenades rained down from the roof. Multiple attack helicopters were sent in and pummeled the seemingly impenetrable fortress with machine guns and rockets, but still, the brothers fought on. The battle lasted 3 hours until 1 p.m., when 10 wire-guided anti-tank missiles were fired at the building, reducing it to a pile of rubble. For 20 minutes, the battle fell silent until American forces entered what little remained of the building and discovered the dead brothers. The only survivor was Mustafa, Qusay's son, who, upon discovery, opened fire on the soldiers and was shot dead. American forces were certain they had who they were looking for, but required official identification, and so the bodies were transported to Baghdad for testing. The two brothers had attempted to disguise by changing their hair and beard, but DNA tests confirmed they were the two infamous brothers. Upon hearing the news, Saddam declared, "We thank God for honoring us with their martyrdom for his sake. If Saddam Hussein had 100 sons other than Uday and Qusay, Saddam Hussein would have offered them on the same path." Nawaf al-Zaidan and his family were paid their $30 million reward and sent to live in the USA with new identities. Following the brothers' death, photographs of their bodies were published in both America and Iraq to prove to the people of Iraq that the feared sons of Saddam were dead. Both had been shot around 20 times and had to have their bodies reconstructed to be identifiable. The images caused controversy both in America and the Arab world. Many on both sides thought the display of their dead bodies was repugnant, while others, due to the amount of reconstruction the bodies had undergone, believed it was nothing more than a hoax. The American justification for the photographs was to let innocent Iraqis know that the regime would no longer harm them, and to let those insurgents carrying on the fight that it was all in vain. American forces were unsure what to do with the bodies. There were fears that, if they were buried, their graves would become sites of pilgrimage for pro-Baathists, while they also feared cremation, unacceptable in the Islamic faith, would only offend the Iraqis and cause further problems between the people of Iraq and the new occupying force. The bodies of the two brothers and Saddam were eventually transported to Tikrit, where they were buried alongside each other in the family plot.